Hi, and welcome to tonight's live music tech webinar. This term we're going to be looking at music tech basics. We're going to take it right back to the start and just give you guys some insight into the things that you should be looking at and the things that you should be kind of incorporating into your recording techniques and into your mixing. We're not necessarily going to go into the finer details at this stage, but we just want to give you an overview of how to kind of sculpt these things, and then you can shape them in your own way as you progress through. So we're going to look at the sonic qualities this week. The sonic qualities are made up of 4 areas, and it's really important that any mix, any recording will include these 4 areas. So here's the content breakdown. So the sonic qualities, quick overview, and then we're going to look at the dynamic range, the frequency range, the stereo field, and the depth of field, which are the 4 sonic qualities. And as you approach your if you're a student and you're approaching your exams, you will need to know these in depth, okay? And at the end we'll kind of cover a little bit of that terminology and all the slang and the jargon that is thrown around, because if you're taking your exam, they do expect you to answer the questions with a certain amount of technical terms. So making sure that you're phrasing your terms in the correct way is important. So first off, the sonic qualities. So what are the sonic qualities? The dynamic range. When you think about dynamics, you're thinking about loudness. You're thinking about how loud your mix can possibly get. And this has to be sculpted. There's many ways about kind of dealing with loudness. And it's not like just turning up your volume on the radio or your speakers, because you've got to think, actually, when you're mixing or when you're recording, your loudness of your meters and your recording have to suit not just your speakers, but they have to suit headphones, and they have to suit small speakers and large speakers and big sound systems. So this has to really be taken into account, and I'll show you a few techniques for how to deal with that in a second. The next thing is the frequency range, which is the human hearing. It's the tone made up within the mix, and shaping those frequencies to make sure that all of the instruments, so making sure they're all sitting at their own place within frequencies and tones. The next thing is the stereo field, and we call it the stereo field, but that's changed dramatically. It's really the positioning of your speakers and where you want the instruments to sound within the speakers. Conventional practice is the stereo field, but as we move through this, you'll see that there's actually more to it than just a left-right mix, as is the stereo field. And finally, the depth of field. It's also often that we will mix in isolation and we'll record in isolation, and we will take all the life of the room out of all of our recordings. This is a good thing, but actually making sure you put the life back in is more important. So we'll cover that as well. So those are the 4 sonic qualities. The dynamic range, so how quiet it is to how loud it is. The frequency range, so the lowest frequencies to the highest frequencies. The stereo field, the far left speaker, the center, and the far right speaker. And then the depth of field, which is the space that you are in. So the dynamic range is measured in decibels, or dB. You'll see this a lot. When you are thinking about recording, you're thinking about how many decibels you're putting into your mix. And we do this with our gain dial. So when we're recording, we deal with gain. Now, I push the gain very high when I'm recording. But you've got to remember, if you push it to +6 to +8, in a digital setup, there is no give. It will just crackle and it will distort and it will be horrible. In an analog setup, you think about people like the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson, and their main mission was to push that gain as high as it could possibly go, because with the analog setup, that gain actually gave it quite a nice bit of warmth at the top end, and the fuzz that you would get from an analog is not as destructive as the noise that you would get from a digital system. So I do push my gain quite high, but generally I won't let it go below -8 decibels, and it would be very rare that it will go +4 decibels. Okay, so again, you're allowed to do that. If you push it much higher than that, you've got to be a bit careful. When you get into the mixing side of things, then we start talking about volume, and then we start bringing those gain dials, that recorded input, down. Okay, and this is what I was talking to you about at the very beginning, just a moment ago, is we're looking for the optimal recording volume. So when we're talking about dynamic range, we're talking about the optimal recording volume. Now, if you look at recent recordings by Metallica and heavy rock bands, they're once again they're pushing these limits, and it is pushing the limits, and it's done with a limiter, okay? And what they're doing is they're making sure that all of their volumes are hitting the threshold. Now, if you want your recordings to sound perfect with headphones and small speakers and large speakers, we do use a lot of limiting, but we limit to 0 dB. In order for when you're doing your task, if you get a commercial piece of music from iTunes or something and put it into your DAW, your Logic or your Cubase, and just watch the meters, you'll see that the meters never go past 0 dB, and they very rarely go much lower than that, and they've got that down to a fine art of this 0 dB. And the closer you get it to 0 dB with that kind of precision, you will get it to sound a lot more precise across many different speakers. If you start thinking, oh, well, I just want it louder, so I'm going to take it into +2 or +4, it actually will go against you, because you've got to remember the listener can crank up their own volume. They don't need you to give them more gain at this point, because they can crank up their own volume depending on their own speaker setup. But if you adhere to that 0 dB and making sure that everything kind of fits within that, you're gonna be a real winner. So how do we get it to 0 dB and stop it from going over? We're going to talk about headroom now. Headroom is basically, if you look at where my mouse is now, if you pushed it into 0 during your mixing stages, you left yourself no headroom, okay? And if you leave yourself no headroom and you apply a limiter to it, you're going to get what's called ducking, okay, where basically it just chops off the top end of your mix. It sounds awful, unless that's what you're going for, of course. So what we tend to do is try and get ourselves between 2 and 4 decibels of headroom during the mixing stage. So when we get to mastering, we can then put all of that back using limiters, reducing the chances of us getting any kind of ducking effect, okay? Some of the process we use, so we've talked about gain. Gain is when we're recording. That's the dial you get when you're recording your instruments in. Volume is the mixing stage when we're pulling all the volumes down. Compression is a really good technique, and we're gonna talk more about compression later on, but this basically reduces the dynamic width, okay, or the dynamic range. In that if you've got a vocal and they're singing quite quietly and then they have loud points, it will reduce the volume between the quietest points to the loudest points, making it seem more consistent. And for commercial music, that is such an important part about what we do. We get the vocal to sit on top of the mix, and we do that with lots of compression, or with a good amount of compression. Once again, I'll go through these settings, but it's important to know in your arsenal you will need a compressor. And then we've talked about limiter. Maximizer, very similar. I tend not to rely on maximizers too much. I tend to go to compression, but we will talk about that as well. And then gating is really about getting rid of the unwanted sound and cleaning your sounds up. So there's a brief overview of the dynamic range and how you control it at each of the possible stages. So you'll control it with gain during the recording stage, you'll control it with compression and volume during the mixing stage, and then you'll control it even further with limiting and multiband compression during the master stage. Okay, on to the next. So there's the first one. The next one is the frequency range. Now, the human ear is 20/20. You'll quite often hear people say, oh, I've got eyesight of 20/20, and it's the same with hearing. 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz is the human ear. It is possible to get lower frequencies than that, and it is possible to get higher frequencies than that. But when you're looking at your EQ and when you're looking at your frequencies, there's little point in doing much more than that. So what have we got within frequencies? We're looking at 20 hertz being our very low frequencies and 20 kilohertz being our very high frequencies. Now, frequencies can be also controlled, because you've got to think about this when you're sculpting your mix, and this is really done at the mixing stage, not during the recording stage. When you're sculpting your mix, you're trying to make each of the instruments stand its own ground. Now, we do that with volume, obviously, but the other way is with frequency as well, and obviously we're also going to do it with our stereo field and panning as well. But to look at frequency for a moment, so for instance, if I had a piano that was sitting on the same frequencies as, say, the guitar, first of all I'm going to separate them in the stereo field, but then I'm also going to kind of look at ways in which I can kind of pull the mix around. Now, you're quite sorry, the frequencies around. And you'll quite often hear people say it's better to cut frequencies, which is bring the frequencies down within an area, than it is to boost. And that's completely true. And I tend to do this a lot. I tend to kind of bring volumes down, bring frequencies down. So if I'm hearing that I've actually got to bring my piano up here, what I'll really do is I'll find the instrument that's clashing with it, and I'll go into that instrument and bring that down by the same portion, giving me the same effect, but actually it's a less destructive way of doing it. Sometimes it can't be helped, and you will just bring it up. The different ways of controlling frequency, then, we've got them here. So we've got high pass filters and low pass filters, which basically take over these areas. So the high pass filter cuts out all of the low frequencies, letting the high frequencies through, and it's controlled by this cutoff point here. So as you pull the cutoff point this way, this whole envelope here will go with it, okay, cutting off all of these low frequencies. And this is the same with a high pass filter. I can't actually see the cutoff point, but it should be here. It's probably this one here, to be fair. And it's the same here. So with the low pass filter, and you pull it out, it's cutting off all of the high frequencies and leaving all the low frequencies. And it's quite, it does cut it. It's not like a shelf. Shelf filters, you can either have them cut or you can have them boosted. But with the cut-off frequencies, you have this. And you hear it a lot in dance music, where you'll hear the sweep come in, where they kind of just introduce the high-pass filter or the low-pass filter. And you should really test this out. Put in your DAW now, or whenever you want, put a song into your mix and just apply a high pass filter and drag the cutoff point right out and see what happens. Then drag it all the way back and see what happens. Test this. It's very worth it, actually. Okay, the next kind of filter, or the next kind of thing that we have is this band pass. Band pass is not controlled via a cutoff point. It's controlled by a center frequency, which is this one here. Predominantly it's the same thing. If you pull the center frequency around, it would give you the same effect. It would just kind of pull the frequencies around as you want. And once again, you can set the bandwidth, which is this envelope here, being very wide or very narrow. And it's also called the Q. If you were working with low pass filters or high pass filters, it would be called the slope, but we call it the Q when we're dealing with band pass. And that's also a good experiment. Boost the band pass filter and drag it around and see what happens. I think you'll like the effect. The last one that we're going to look at today is the notch filter. If you want to get rid of a particular frequency, if your vocal is kind of popping, even you should have a pop shield, of course, but if they're popping, you might just think, okay, I can just get rid of that. I can use a notch filter just to get rid of that particular frequency. It's not affecting my vocal, which is up here maybe. I'll just come down here and I'll pull the notch filter and I'll get rid of that particular sound that I don't want. It's very useful if something's happening in your mix. It's just a very subtle thing, but it's happening on a particular frequency. The notch filter is a go-to character. And as you can see in this graph, you can combine all of these different envelopes and all these different filters to kind of shape your sound. Be very aware of the other sounds in your mix. Don't, for instance, one of the things that I used to do in my early days of mixing was I used to love treble, I used to love bass. And my mum had this car radio where you could actually dial in all the frequencies using a multi-band EQ, graphic equalizer. And I used to be there and I used to tweak the high-pitched frequency, I used to tweak the low frequencies. By then I had this really thumping sound in my mum's car. But be very careful. It's something you like to do. If you've got a guitar, a bass, if you've got a vocal, a piano, your ear tends to hone into these high frequencies and hone into these low frequencies, and you keep pushing them until you've got these one-sided mixes. And what you're really trying to do is sculpt out space. You're trying to sculpt out an area for that particular instrument. So if you're sculpting the same area for each instrument, it's going to sound pretty naff. You should be sculpting the instruments differently depending on their frequency range, which I'm going to show you here. This is a fantastic resource. IndependentRecording.net have got some really good visual aids for frequencies, and you should really have one of these on your wall when you're mixing, because if you've got a female vocal that you're mixing, you should know that her predominant pitches or predominant tones are going to be between this 1K point and between this kind of 8K point, okay? So if you're tweaking around at your EQ, you know that you're going to really have a big impact there. And if you've got a male vocal and a female vocal on the same range, you can kind of think, okay, I'm gonna boost this female vocal around the 6K, but I'm gonna drop this male vocal around the 4K, or boost it around the 4K, just shaping them so that they can sit together, but you can hear both of them in the mix. And if you look through this, you can actually see how all of these instruments range depending on who it is and how it fits within this. One thing I should have said, let's go back to this, is it's called hertz now, but before it was called hertz, it was called cycles per second, okay? And you might want to just do a quick Google to find out what that means, but cycles per second is very relative to pitch, and I can't remember the complete theory, but basically a certain amount of cycles per second would equal the pitch of C, and so on. Okay, that's it for frequency. So we've looked at two so far: dynamic range and the frequency range. Now the stereo field, another fantastic resource which I learned so much from in my kind of early days, is The Art of Mixing by David Gibson. He has this very visual approach to mixing, and he kind of says, okay, if this is a rock record, this is the way that the mix should be looking, this is how it should be panned out, or this is where the volume should sit. And it's very detailed. You can kind of see how everything kind of fits together. He's got this piano which should be sit across the mix. He's got this vocal that should definitely be in the centre. He's got this kick drum that should be in the centre of the mix. Bass drum that should be in the centre but slightly more fatter around it. Where the cymbals should be placed. And that's really visual. And if you want to learn more about the stereo field, and if you want to learn more about mixing in general, it's a very good book to get. And like I say, these are the kind of graphics that he shows depending on the actual mix that you're going for, whether it be a pop, a rock, a reggae, and whatever else. So the stereo field, as said previously, and I think I've got another slide for that, here we go. As said previously, it's a bit, it's not true anymore really, it shouldn't really called stereo field, it's more of speaker placement, let's call it that. Because you have lots of different speaker setups, and depending on what you're mixing for, whether it's film, or whether it's radio, or whether it's popular music, or whatever, you're going to find that they favour different setups. Now, it's always been the convention for music to be in stereo, and that's pretty much still the same way. I bought the Beach Boys album about a year ago, and that's in surround sound. That sounds amazing on my surround sound system. But the convention is stereo. But when you start looking at surround sound, there's so many different ones now. It used to be the 5.1, where you've got 5 speakers, a centre, a left and a right, and a rear left and right, plus a subwoofer. That used to be the convention for film. Then it went to 7.1, and I think there might even be a 7.2 now. Before all these existed, and stereo existed, you also had quadraphonic, which is basically double stereo, to give you this illusion that sound was all around you, but it was just basically double stereo. So really we should be thinking about speaker placement. Where do we want our instruments to sit within the speaker placement? Do we want to sit on the left? Do we want to sit on the right? And it's very important when you're sculpting your space. Yes, you've got volume, and everyone thinks about space as volume, but that's not really true. So yes, you've got volume, so you can punch up the volume, then you look at the frequency, so you can kind of sculpt all of the different sounds, making sure you take full advantage of their frequency ranges, and then you look at stereo fields, give them more placement within the mix so that everything's not sitting in the middle. For instance, if you had the lead guitar and the vocal sat in the middle of the mix, you would barely hear the vocal because the lead guitar would just take it. And that's where automation comes in. Because if you've got a lead guitar that has a solo, and you're obviously going to want to take him from the left side and put him into the centre during that period, and then automate him back out after he's finished his solo. So those are 3 ways. And then finally, we're looking at depth of field. So depth of field, in the early days, 1950s, 1940s and before, you would basically just set up a microphone in a hall of your choosing, and placement of halls was very important back then. To get that sound that you wanted, it was very important. You quite often hear people say, oh, we got it from this particular chamber, or we got it from this particular hall, or we got it from this particular stadium, or whatever else. And that's how it was for a very long time, is you would find the space, or you would get someone to build you a space that would kind of fit your needs of your rock song, or your ballad, or your reggae song, and you'd do that. As things have pushed on, we've included reverb rather than actual spaces, rather than room acoustics. And in order to get the reverb absolutely right, it's really important that you take out all of the space. And that's why we talk about isolation. It's really important for our mixes in modern recording techniques to make sure you get as much isolation for each and every instrument and voice as possible. Because if you put reverb on top of a room, it does sound a bit weird sometimes, depending on the room, of course. And you get this kind of doubling effect of the actual reverb, especially if you've got a lot of delay. It could be what you want, of course, but more often than not, it's not. So once we've taken all the sound out, you have to put it all back. And I see some of my students sometimes, and they'll put reverb on one or two of the tracks, then they'll leave the others. And I say, why do you think everything sounds like it's been recorded in a different room? I don't know, sir. Because, you basically set it up that way. So when you're applying reverb, apply the same reverb initially. It will change, obviously, if you want to apply different reverbs, but that's fine. But initially, apply the same reverb across all instruments to make sure that you've got that consistency, to make sure they're all playing in the same room. Unless you're going for something a lot more weirder, you quite often hear people say, I give the vocal a different reverb and I'll give a vocal a different delay. And that's absolutely acceptable. But first off, initially, the starting steps should be give everything the same reverb, give it space back to it, because you've taken the space out and you've lost all of that ambience and you've lost all of that kind of presence and that feel, then you have to put it back. Now, there's a few different options. Abbey Road, which the Beatles recorded a lot of their albums at, used this plate reverb and chambers. Plate reverbs are massive, and there's just basically a massive bit of plate with a couple of pickups on them, and literally the sound goes in through one pickup and comes out the other end, and it adds all the vibration to it. You then have sorry, I lost where I was. You also then have spring reverb, which you'll find in a lot of amps and things like that. It's a cheaper version than the plate. The plate tends to give quite a lush sound. Moving on from that, you obviously have your chambers, where you'll chuck your speakers into a chamber and record the sound of the reverb that way. You have your digital reverbs. And more recently, you've also got convolution reverbs, which are basically a way of sampling an actual room. And if you've got Logic or if you've got Cubase, you have very good convolution reverbs built in. So the four ways in which we're sculpting our sound so far: we've got dynamic range, frequency range, stereo field or speaker positioning, and we also have the depth of field. Okay, that brings us to the end. A few things that I don't know if we've got anyone in asking questions tonight. Doesn't look like it, but a few things that you need to take into consideration is, especially if you're taking exams, is consistency with terminology. Make sure you get your terminology exactly the way that your exam body wants them to be. If you're taking Edexcel's Music Tech, just read through their glossaries and make sure you get their terminology right. You'll hear, me included, a lot of jargon being floated around, and sometimes that jargon won't cut it during the exam. So you definitely need to make sure you get your terminology right. Next week we're going to look at more of the sonic qualities. We're going to start with dynamic range again, so we're going to look more in depth at using limiters and using compressors. And then throughout this whole term, for the next 6 weeks, we're going to take on one of those sonic qualities per week and break it down. And we're going to keep this basic series going for probably a couple of terms, just to kind of cover all the important aspects. So thanks for popping by tonight. If you've got any questions or you want to suggest a topic to cover, please feel free to. And hopefully we'll catch you all next week.